Welcome to Pictures of the Past, Picture the Future, an Earth Week presentation. Brought to you by Bruce Power, Innovation at Work, and produced by the Bruce County Museum and Cultural Center. Welcome to Earth Week, brought to you by Bruce Power and the Bruce County Museum and Cultural Center. I'm here today with Jarmo Jalava. Jarmo is an ecologist, currently consulting with the Saugeen Ojibway Nation and with past experience with many environmental organizations, from the local to the international. He's also a musician, writing and recording songs on social and eco-justice themes. Thanks for having me here today, and tell me, why did you choose this spot for our interview?
Thanks, Mike. The place that I've chosen to be interviewed is actually the place that I've chosen to live on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula. Moved here just about 3 years ago. We lived in Stratford, but before that we lived in Bruce County for a number of years as well, and I've worked up here for many years, really since the early 1990s. I'm an ecologist. This landscape has really become very, very dear to my heart. I've really worked most of my life now to try to encourage people to understand the ecology of the area, so the plants and animals and how they all interact in the ecosystems that are here and how that relates to the land. These days I a lot of my work is with Saugeen Ojibway Nation Environment Office, and also the Neyashingaming community, so the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. And so I think one of the first things that I would want to say around choosing this place is it almost chose me, and I was invited by the communities really to work with them, and so it's a real honor to work here, but also it's an honor to work here to try to build an understanding of the land from the perspective of the people who have been living here for thousands of years. So that's really important, and living here in a sustainable way. So those are some of the reasons. Also, there's just a spectacular view here. In terms of history, this is quite an amazing area because it's actually called the Sky Lake Drumlin Field, and so right now we're standing, and the house I live in is on top of a drumlin, which is a feature that occurred probably as a result of the glaciers depositing with all the water, the meltwater from the glaciers back thousands and thousands of years ago, so 10 to 15,000 years ago. This was all under ice, and then it all melted, and these teardrop-shaped hills were created. And so we're on top of one of these hills, so it's quite dry up here, and it's quite high, as you can see. But then between these hills, and there's a bunch of them, are these long wetlands that connect up to the rivers that flow into Lake Huron. So from an ecological point of view, this is a really interesting and diverse area, in part because there's still a lot of natural area remaining, a lot of forest. There are big wetlands, and where you're looking in the picture right back there is Isaac Lake, the Isaac Lake area, and then the Rankin River wetland system flows sort of behind me here, and that's Sky Lake up to the northwest over there. So we'll probably get a bit of a better picture of Sky Lake a bit later in the interview. While there's been forest cleared, a lot of the agriculture that's going on here is still it's pasture and hay fields, and so it's kind of like the old days in a sense. When the Europeans first came here, they cleared the land, and mainly there was livestock. There was a bit of crop growing. I'm not a history expert by any means, but mainly people lived cattle and dairy were important parts of the agricultural system, as far as I know. So, and what's been happening in recent years, in part because it's not that easy being a farmer. It's hard to make a living, and the prices of corn and soybeans, but especially up here, corn and canola, are crops that you can actually earn a pretty decent living with those crops. So there's been a fair bit of change in terms of agriculture throughout Bruce County, really, in the past 20 or so years, and it relates mostly to just being able to earn a living off the land, and then also maybe some more sort of big business interests in the agriculture, whereas this, it used to be the smaller family farms, and farms are getting bigger and that sort of thing. So those are the sorts of changes, some of the things that have been happening. But so what's special about here is there's still a lot of natural area, and then that more sort of pasture land type agriculture, which means that there are lots of birds and lots of wildlife. And I'm a crazy bird watcher. I have been since I was 13, 14 years old. And this is just an amazing spot to see lots of birds, sandhill cranes, and all kinds of ducks and eagles and all that. So that's part of the reason I'm here too. A big part of the reason.
You're absolutely right. It is a paradise for birders.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, I'll just mention there's been a snowy owl right here, right on our property for about 5 days. He's not here while we're filming right now. But if you look behind, we've got our compost pile here, and then he was sitting on the fence post back there a few days ago, and he was waiting for voles or mice to come and eat a little bit. And he actually swooped down and tried to catch one at one point. So it's pretty cool spot. If anyone's seen a snowy owl, you'll know what I mean. They're pretty amazing creatures. So come here from the Arctic. So
yeah.
Yeah.
So I brought some photos from the archives today, and a number of them were taken by Blue Water Outdoor Education staff in the 70s and 80s, and it's the area just south of here. It's the area around Spry Lake and near Boat Lake. And just if you can tell me what you see when you look at those, and what you see in the changes in the land over that time, the past 50 years. I would love to hear your take on that.
Sure. Yeah. So and that really is connected to this whole watershed system that we were just talking about. So Sky Lake's kind of at the top of that, and then we'll just go down a little ways here, exactly at that spot. So what I would say, looking at the photos here, is you see a little bit of cash crop agriculture, I think, and still a fair bit of, there's maybe hay fields, and then around the lake itself, so Spry Lake, there is some forest cover, and my understanding is that a lot of that is now protected land, and the forest is coming back, and that's been the case across much of southern Ontario. So the sort of marginal, so the agricultural lands, the farmlands that weren't really all that productive, have been. So there's actually more forest cover across much of southern Ontario now than there was 50, 70, 80 years ago. And the big changes happened sort of between the mid-1800s and the early 1900s. That's when most of the land was cleared, and in fact on the peninsula here, the land was cleared pretty quickly, and then there was a lot of slash, so debris, wood that wasn't converted into logs and firewood, etc., and there were a lot of big fires too. So much of the peninsula burned back then. So there's been also a lot of forest cover has come back throughout the peninsula, not just in this area because of protected areas, but it's just grown back because after the fires. So.
And we're not sitting on the most viable farming land in the world by any means either.
No, that's right. Yes,
yeah.
That's right. So that's what I would see here. I think it's great that the forest cover that I see in the photo here is coming back along the lake shores, because that's where you kind of need the most along the rivers and wetlands and along the shorelines is where the trees are most important, because they provide they protect from erosion. They stabilize the soil. They also, if it's along a stream or a river, they shade the stream and the river. They keep the waters cooler. A lot of fish species need cool water. A lot of the fish that a lot of people like to eat. I'm allergic to fish, so I can't eat them. But
well, if you catch any by accident, I'll take them off your hands. I'm happy to.
Anyway, so it's really that's great to see, and there's been a lot of good, and I'll just mention also in relation to the agriculture using satellite images or aerial photography and that, and we're able to we have a better understanding from that perspective of what portions of a farm are productive and which ones are actually require more pesticides and more fertilizers and that get too wet and all that they aren't really profitable for farming. So even if those parts of these farms were saved, as allowed to go back to nature, it would actually save money. There'd be more profit, and it would be good for nature.
It's interesting you mentioned shorelines and their value and their importance. Some of the other photos I brought were from the Krug Fawns, the Bruce and Howard Krug, and their work bird banding and counting eggs in nests and all of that in the 50s and 60s. And some of those are from close to here along the Lake Huron shore. A couple are from near Howdenvale, and I know a lot of that shoreline is still fairly rugged and still fairly natural, but I know there's also a challenge with the human use of the shoreline, and with people adjusting the shoreline to make it better for swimming or better for boating or to allow to park a boat and those sorts of things. What does that do to it as an ecosystem, as a habitat?
Yeah, so I'm not an aquatic ecologist, so I can't speak too much about impacts on fish species and that sort of thing. But any sort of modifications. So, for example, a great example is the Saugeen Beach, the dune systems there. They're dependent, or they have been dependent on the water currents that flow along the coasts to bring the sand in from other locations. That's how these dunes originally formed, and in a lot of places they're continuing to form with the water currents. And any changes that you make to shorelines affects the processes that are occurring. So it could be fish spawning habitat. It could be just the movement of the water that would occur naturally. And so when you change the shoreline, you may be kind of making it easier for your personal uses to some degree, but you might be affecting someone else's use just down somewhere down where the water would normally be flowing to. So there are those sorts of impacts.
Sorry, that's worth getting distracted for.
Yeah, so there's a northern harrier just flying down to the pond over there, and he just made a killdeer very upset. So the killdeer may be nesting down there. So. Another thing that happens is that people plant gardens. They plant lawns and gardens, and they bring in plants from the garden center, from the nursery or whatever, and some of these species actually they escape from their gardens, and they become a problem in our natural ecosystem. So some of them,
Phragmites is the big one right now.
Example.
Yes.
Yep.
Purple loosestrife was another one that happened.
Yeah. And then there are many that invade the forest as well. Garlic mustard.
Yes,
and,
of
there's
course.
one that's coming. It isn't. Well, actually, it has been found here now. It's dog strangling vine. It's called.
Yeah.
And it's really nasty. It'll just take over the forest, and so so that's another thing that happens. People it's all done kind of inadvertently. No one wants to harm nature necessarily, or most people don't. But what's really important is just to understand how the ecosystems work and all these relationships. And
Mm-hmm.
there are many insect species, native insect species that are normally have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years,
Mm-hmm.
and they depend on certain native plants that would normally be here and that are still here in order to reproduce. The larvae, the little caterpillars or whatever, will only eat the leaves of one, just like monarch butterflies and milkweed. So, but that's the same across the insect spectrum. So the native insect species are the food for all kinds of birds, and then the little birds are food for bigger birds, and the whole chain of and also not just birds but reptiles, amphibians, etc. So these food chains and food webs are all affected, and they've all evolved, grown here together, and they all depend on each other. And when we start introducing new species, it often can affect the whole food web.
Mm-hmm.
And so a species, just the same way if you change your shoreline and affect the current of the water flowing along the shoreline, and it affects your neighbor's beach that they once had, but now there's no sand coming there.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing happens throughout the food webs as well. So the kind of key message there is to really try to understand. The more you understand about ecology, the more you understand how dependent we are as people on the ecology around us, and how dependent all the different animals and plants are on each other. And that, to me, relates right back to the way that the Anishinaabe people,
Mm-hmm.
who were the original people here,
Mm-hmm.
and still are, this is their territory, and that there was that understanding of how we have these relationships, and we kind of need to have respect and be grateful for these gifts that are around us, and to ensure that they survive and prosper for future generations.
So, interesting side question. You mentioned the effects that removing or changing the abundance of one species has on the ecosystem and the food web as a whole. I have two examples that I think of, and one is an awful one, and a species. There's not a lot of species I would like to get rid of, but starlings. And introduced due to whimsy, a theater fan who wanted to bring the birds that Shakespeare mentions,
Yes.
and due to one mention of a starling in one play once, we now have this species that crowds out a lot of native species. What happens though then if there were a way to remove all the starlings in the ecosystems in the States where Asian carp have infiltrated and become and have taken over parts of the ecosystem? What happens then when you take that away?
First off, I would, in response to that question, because it's a really great question, I was at a meeting, it was about 10 years ago, I think, at Gedgewinong, so Walpole Island First Nation, and there were quite a few elders from the community at the meeting, and we were talking about conservation as a group, and also what to do about invasive species, introduced species that are at Walpole Island, which is just at the sort of south end of Lake Huron, a bit south on Lake St. Clair, and more than one elder, as I recall, said, because we were all talking about how do we get rid of the black locust, how do we get rid of the phragmites, how do we get rid of the white sweet clover, and they said, well, let's just slow down a little bit here. Maybe they're here because they want to teach us something. Maybe we have something to learn from them. And so what I've come to, and I was kind of pretty gung-ho, we've got to get rid of these things. And in some cases, I think it is really important. I think a lot of the work that's being done to remove phragmites is really good work. It's that tall grass that's invading all the wetlands. So there's a lot of work that's important that needs to be done just because it's kind of a desperate situation. But at the same time, I think in the long run, it's more important that we our understanding grows deeper, and we don't see these things as enemies that we just have to wipe off out of our area. They're here now. We're I've come from a European background. I think you do
Yes,
too.
yes, I do as well.
And so we're all species move around, and people have moved around, and so I think it's more important that we try to prevent it from happening again, and we really learn how our ecosystems work and what these relationships are. And the more we understand that, the more we'll want to preserve our native species. And in fact, what I'm doing here at my place, you can see I've planted a cedar tree, I've planted a juniper, and all the plants that I'm planting these days in the garden are indigenous native species to this part of Ontario, this part of the world. So, and that's the kind of thing that we can all do. And then then we attract an insect. We plant some milkweed. We get a monarch butterfly. We get to watch the butterfly cycle, and then the butterfly, they come back the next year after their great grandchildren, great grandchildren come back the next year and nest possibly on the same milkweed. So yeah.
Thankfully, we're not working on a project for archives of a family tree of monarch butterflies.
Yes, that's right.
That would be a difficult one to trace.
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned that we're a part of this, and I mean, to use the harshest terminology possible, we're an invasive species as well.
Yes, very much so.
So next, I'd like to take you into the future, and we have some good stories to tell.
Sandhill cranes are a great example. They were basically overhunted about 100 years ago. They were completely hunted off the southern part of Ontario. They were only found in northern and northwestern Ontario, and thanks to the banning of hunting of sandhill cranes, they've returned just like bald eagles.
For our audience today, for those grade 5 and 6 students throughout Bruce County and some in Grey County as well who are watching, what do you do?
Connect with a chickadee. That's a chickadee calling over there. Go out and find a snake. But don't play around with it too much. Just watch it, see what it does. Get a pair of binoculars, see what you can see, whether it's just looking up at the stars or and then read about what you see. Try to figure out what you see, and there are all kinds of tools available, especially young people. Tend to be way better than us old geezers at figuring out how all these technological things work. But there's so much information out there, so many great ways. Things like iNaturalist, so you can just take a picture of whatever creature you see, whether it's a bug, a bird, if you can get a picture of your bird on your smartphone, or a plant, an interesting looking plant, and go to iNaturalist and put it in there, and it'll kind of give you some suggestions. You can even say, oh, I think it's this one, and then other people will let you know what it actually was. It's a great way to learn, but it also, the more of those pictures we get into iNaturalist, the more everyone understands about our nature, and it's a great way to document history too. That way we can show that yes, people were seeing snapping turtles along the road, and that's actually one of the things that roads are a big issue, and people driving fast on roads and not stopping for turtles, and that's a whole other area of discussion. So, which we were talking about before the interview as well. But so really, what would I say to that? If we understand that turtles live a very long time, and that's their sort of evolutionary advantage, because most of the eggs they lay either get dug up by raccoons and skunks and foxes and coyotes and turkeys and whatever, and so then the young, if they hatch, there are these little vulnerable things that try to get back into the water. So the turtles lay their eggs on the side of in sandy areas often, or gravel, usually a nice warm sunny spot. Well, we've created these nice warm sunny spots by building our roads, so the turtles end up going to the roadsides, digging their little holes in females, and they lay their eggs in the holes, but at the same time they're often crossing the roads, they get run over by people, and turtles live a long time, as I said, and that one mother turtle is, if she thinks like we do, she would be thinking, okay, I'm going to live 35, 40, 50, 80 years. I hope that one or two of these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of eggs survives, so that to replace me when I'm old and I die. So only one or two of those need to survive. But the way nature is set up, most of them don't. And if a female turtle on her way to lay the eggs, or even after she's laid the eggs, gets run over by a car, we've just lost that 1 in 10,000 chance, or whatever it is, in the future of one of those young ones surviving. So that's how important it is to allow these turtles to come and nest wherever they're nesting, and with that hope that one or two of their little eggs will survive to make it back to the water, and then eventually survive another 5-10 years or however long it takes before they actually start breeding and mating and laying their own eggs. So it's a tough life. Turtles are great creatures, and they're very important to the Saugeen Ojibway Nation as well. They're totem animals. So
Well,
yes.
we all live on their back.
Yes, we all live on Turtle Island. That's right. Yes.